So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this discussion on economy and budget, the first in the series of the India Economic Forum. I have the pleasure of joining in by Mr. Samir Kochar, his chairman Scotch, the eminent panelists, and our moderator, Dr. Amirullah Khan. With this, I request Mr. Kocher to do the context setting with the backgrounder as well. And thereafter, I'll request Mr. Amirullah Khan to take over and do the context, pose the questions, do the discussion. The way it is conducted is that, there is no specific time, which is what, 2 or 3 minutes that everyone is taking. It is an interactive discussion. The questions are posed, then we seek answers to that, and then we move on to the next. So this is how it is done. We have the liberty of exceeding our time limit, which is 7:30, in case so required. So with this, I request Mr. Kocher.
Well, namaskar and thank you. It's indeed a pleasure to have you all with us in this curtain raiser session of the third India Economic Forum. It's an unparalleled kind of a conference that we've been doing for 3 years, because this is a space that is provided for all the economists to come together. Unlike other economic forums, and where you get the Babaji and the Guruji and the actor thrown in as well, we are very particular, we're very caste conscious on that. So you have to be an economist to qualify to speak. The only guy who's the non-Brahmin here is me. I am not, fortunately, an economist. My formal education was only till class 12. And the secret behind me organizing India Economic Forum is that it gives me a lot of canned wisdom, which lasts me the whole year. So I can pick up everyone's talking points and pretend to be an economist for one full year after this. And so let me just share with you what we have lined up. For this India Economic Forum and LITFest, we've already got a panel of about 32 economists. By the time we're done with the agenda, there will be 60 of them. The reason why I think this economic discussion space is very important is in the past 2-3 years, we find that all the public policy discourse, all policy discourse, even economic policy discourse, seems to be getting hijacked, either by people who are in public policy advocacy business, which are, very nice way of calling lobbyists, or by lawyers. So everything is either tied up in court, and the entire policy discourse. And the third, of course, is the technocrats, the big tech industry. And increasingly, you find that the space for an economic discussion is getting squeezed. Maybe because of the COVID, 2 years, there was no space, but we felt it's very important to have all the economists together and make sure that they're heard with the kind of gravitas that they're required to be heard with, given the kind of situation that we are in. So we have put together this India Economic Forum, and a lot of contemporary topics and what is very important for India is being discussed. Just to give you the backdrop against which this is being done, even before the run-up to the budget, there were a lot of bad reports coming, whether it was from CMI, from World Economic Forum, from Oxfam, etc., which said economy is on a thin ice. Unemployment rate is up, inflation is up, interest rate is up, rupee is down, new investments are down, salary jobs are down, consumer demand and capacity utilization are both low. And if you guys look, the risk factors that WEF finds for India is fracture of interstate relations, debt crisis in large economies, widespread youth disillusionment. We've seen some stuff happening in UP on jobs, failure of technology governance, and digital inequality. On the other hand, if you look at state finances, they're even more precarious than ever. I mean, debt to GDP ratio, fiscal deficit, borrowing, all are in the worrying space. Now, I don't understand all of this, but all I know is that this can't be good news. But this is one set of news. And I don't know whether all this data is correct, incorrect, how seriously we should take it. We should take it with a fistful of salt. That is something I'm here to learn from this panel. The second discussion that I just had even just today was on LinkedIn. This is an educated guy, lot of big four lawyers, academics, etc. So LinkedIn, it's not Facebook or Twitter. So with this gentleman has massaged some World Bank data, and he said that poverty in India is down to 6%, and next year is going to be 3%. And he says that whatever everybody else is saying is blessed. So that's the second part of the discourse. Now this is the educated youth I am talking about. The third part of it is, you may have all read this, Bibek's discussion this morning in Mint, where he says that it is not a K-shaped recovery. We are actually, we don't have any data evidence that this recovery is K-shaped. And if you just take urban data and extrapolate that, then it's a fallacy of composition. So these are three different narratives. And as a non-economist, I am completely confused. And on top of that, there was the budget, and so some people have been praising it, some people have been condemning it as usual, and markets have been doing their funny dance. So it is in this backdrop that we are looking at the budget and having this discussion that what are the felt needs of the economy, and is the budget going to address those? At Scotch, we are looking at only three things which may come out of the budget, may not come out of the budget, but we think that's what India needs. I think India needs job generative growth. This job generative growth has to be spatially dispersed, and it has to be an equitable growth. As long as these three things happen, the future of India is safe. With that, I invite Professor Amirullah Khan, who's going to be moderating this session. He can introduce the August panel, also set the backdrop. Amir.
Super. Thanks so much, Samir. Thanks, Gulshan. And there we have Yamini, who we can't see or hear, but I'm sure we will in a bit. So, there she is. There she is. Hi, Yamini. Welcome.
You may not want to hear from me, but my voice is loud enough for you to hear regardless.
So now that you have joined, we can start. Right. So thanks so much, everybody. Samir, thanks for setting that context, and also thanks for so carefully choosing a panel that reflects every specialization that we would like to talk about, from capital markets to labor to agriculture to the macroeconomic fundamentals. And each one here, for those of you who are listening, is the absolute expert on these issues. Thanks so much, Dr. Patnaik, Dr. Kapoor, Professor Mahendra Dev, Dr. Sudipto Mandal, Mr. Ajay Thakur, and Dr. Yamini Iyer, who have joined us in this panel. What we will do, as we have time...
Dr. Amar Patnaik.
Amar Patnaik, of course, that's the first name that I took. So, and I know him well, the kind of contribution he has made. Someone who understands economy much more than we economists do, because he's also there in the policy making space for quite a while now. So thanks so much for joining, and thanks also to Samir and for Gulsharan to have given adequate time. So we are not rushed for the next 25 minutes to discuss everything that we have to discuss. We have a fair bit of time. So please feel free to dwell on the issues, to explain to us what you feel and how and why, so that at the end of it, we can get a set of points that we can use to not only educate the population, but also to push for, to ask for meaningful reform as we go ahead. So we'll go across all these, as many issues as we can. The formal introductions for those of you who are listening is that Dr. Amar Patnaik is a member of parliament in the upper house. He represents the Biju Janata Dal, and therefore is privy to some of the most innovative governance experiments that we have seen coming out of Orissa. He's been the national spokesperson. He's a technology expert. He's been the party's IT wing head. He's been a civil servant and a former official at the CAG. Been at the World Bank and the UN. Did his PhD from one of our finest institutions, the XIMB in Bhubaneswar. working on rural India. Yamini, very old and a very dear friend, apart from being one of our finest economists who has worked in several areas. The Accountability Initiative is known by her name. She's been heading our finest think tank, the Center for Policy Research, and is the go-to person for a number of issues, including the one that I currently work on, which is healthcare. Professor Mahendra Dev was here with us in Hyderabad for several years, then moved, heads now as Vice Chancellor, the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, is again possibly our biggest expert on food security, agriculture, nutrition, etc. Dr. Radhika Kapoor at ICRIER has worked on labor issues across the world with the Planning Commission, has studied at the LSE and at Cambridge. Someone who I have read and studied and learned a lot from, Professor Sudipto Mandal at the NCAR, a member of the 14th Finance Commission, National Statistical Commission, at the Reserve Bank of India, and someone who's among the few people who's given NIPFP the status that it enjoys today. Ajay Kumar Thakur understands capital markets well, heads the SME exchange at the Bombay Stock Exchange, and is responsible for making the BSE SME 55,000 crore market cap index. He's been at the BSE and understands the one sector that we are all concerned about now, which is the medium and small scale sector. So you will see that the panel has been very, very carefully chosen. These are not only the best people in their fields, but also represent every important sector that concerns us as far as India is concerned. My first question is a very brief one, and I would like all of you to just keep your answer to a sentence. And that concerns just this budget that is now 3 days old. Sorry for doing this, but I am forcing this on you, which is that if I were to ask you to write your column on the budget, what would your headline be? So just a phrase, not even a complete sentence, because headlines are not complete sentences. So just a phrase that tells us what you think of this year's budget. And let me arbitrarily choose Mr. Ajay Kumar Thakur to start. Yes, Ajay.
Very good evening to all of you. Thank you for inviting me for this panel discussion. If one line I have to say, I will say that it's a very progressive budget, touching upon both old economy and new economy, and try to have a balance between both.
Thank you, Ajay. It was a little more than a phrase, but said very well. All right, Radhika.
The devil lies in the details.
Well done. Well done. Sudipto Mandal, please.
Well, I think it's a budget made in very challenging times to navigate through very difficult waters, and I think she has done a good job.
Excellent. Professor Mahendra Dev.
Big push to infrastructure, but more could have been done for inclusive development.
Yamini.
It was a difficult task in a difficult time, and clear policy choices had to be made. The trade-off was investing in people versus investing in infrastructure and a virtual future. We did the latter, not the former. The consequences will be seen to understand.
Wonderful. So that leaves you, Dr. Patnaik.
I would just say 2 words: missed opportunity.
Missed opportunity. Thank you so much. Samir, would you like to chip in?
No, not in the. Me and Gusharan are only listening. As I said, I use the opportunity to learn and then pick up your points.
I know that's a good way out.
For 1 year.
That's a good way out, right? Thanks so much. Thank you so much for being so very cooperative in doing this surprise that I sprung on you. But I use this to get back to you on what clearly is the consensus that emerges, which is that we are living in challenging times. That's what all of you are saying, and that it was not a great time. It was a difficult time for Nirmala Sitharaman to write out a whole entire budget. Now, if it is challenging times, then I get back to Dr. Sudipto Mandal. Dr. Mandal, please tell us, what do you mean when you say challenging times, and what are the challenges? What are the big three challenges?
Yeah, well, first of all, as we all know, we've been just going through this dark tunnel of 2 years of this pandemic, which hit us as a shock on top of a situation where the growth rate had already been coming down.
Yeah.
And so that's the first, big challenge. And now that will require a certain kind of strategy to deal with. However, the complication now is that inflationary pressures are also building up. So policies that would help growth then create a problem for managing inflation on the other side, which is, now close to 5.9%. I mean, I'm talking the consumer price index. And the third challenge is that with quantitative easing in the United States and other parts of the world, interest rates are likely to go up. That is going to put a lot of pressure also on our financial markets. And probably the rise in foreign exchange reserve we saw earlier is now going to get reversed, and that's going to go down. So you've got these three challenging balls in the air, which is what made it very difficult to have a budget to navigate through these troubled waters. Not to mention the point that Yamini was mentioning that, despite what my very good friend Vivek has been saying, clearly the working classes, the poorer classes, and the small medium enterprises have been very badly hit, and there are a lot of indicators of that. It's not as though we don't have data on that. So that's the challenge.
Super. Thanks so much, Dr. Mandal. And that gives me the right cue to get to Dr. Radhika Kapoor. Radhika, the elephant in the room, so to say, is this entire issue of unemployment that Samir also pointed out. And that is what we would like to understand from you. Where are we on the unemployment issue? Is it really as horrifying as it is being made out to be? Is it the educated unemployed? Is it the unskilled worker? What's the story?
The unemployment issue is actually, I think, even more serious than we make it out to be, because the statistic that we actually look at is the unemployment rate. And that is simply telling you how many people there are who are looking for work and have not been able to find work. But in India, very often, because you don't have social safety nets like unemployment insurance, people can't afford to remain unemployed. So they will do all kinds of work. They will create work. They will be self-employed. They will resort to casual work, but they will do something. So they will invariably be underemployed. Now, if you even break up unemployment rates by education levels, you will see that, the least educated, they will have an unemployment rate which is less than 1%, because these are the people who can't afford to be unemployed. But the high unemployment rates you will always see amongst the educated, in particular amongst the youth. So the crisis of underemployment has actually been brewing in the Indian economy now for over 3 decades. And that hasn't been addressed adequately because we don't look at those statistics when we discuss the problem of unemployment. Open unemployment is a problem which is of very recent origin in India, to my mind, because we only recognize the problem of open unemployment when we saw that 6% unemployment rate in the PLFS data in 2017-18. So now we have a very serious crisis where there is one of unemployment. There is also one of underemployment, which has been growing for a long time. And both of these have been exacerbated post-pandemic, accompanied with a rise in informal employment. So things are far worse than a lot of these aggregate statistics suggest.
Wow. Thanks so much. And we knew that, and several of us have been talking about this, but you put it out so plainly out there that it is indeed far more serious than even than what all of us had imagined. Just go back to something else and come back to this issue. But this is where I will bring in Mr. Ajay Kumar Thakur. Ajay, one lazy way of looking at the budget has always been to see how the stock market reacted. And that first day it just zoomed up and came down. God knows what it was doing, and then it has been going down yesterday and today. So what is it that the stock market is seeing that the rest of us aren't? Why is it trending down?
No, but a stock market is always futuristic. But let me tell you, before that, in April, May 2020, we have seen a sharp decline in the market. And after that, all banks across the world, especially United States, have started, quantitative easing, where, United States have printed, money as equal to the GDP of India. And those money have flowed in, across the world, especially in our country. And with today, the situation, if you see in 1.5 years, people don't have the avenues to whereby, they can invest and they can get better returns. If you see the bank return or the return in land investment or other avenues, it is hardly 6-7%. So everybody is looking towards the capital market where they think that return can be moved. And therefore, you have seen a lot of liquidity pumping into the capital market. And last 2 years, we have seen, almost, huge funds pumping into the market. The index, which was 25,000 in March 2020, today it has reached to 60. No, earlier the top was 62,000. And after that, it is quite obvious that it will react. And it is bound to react. There is, nothing saying on that. And there is, when the market keeps on going up, people don't talk much. But when it little bit reacts 10%, 12%, then people start talking about it. So I don't think market has reacted so badly. That's the one thing. Now, let me tell you one more thing that we have seen in this capital market is that till March 2020, we have around 30 million investors registered with BSE. Now it has grown to, almost 9.5 crores. So 6.5 crores new investors have entered into the capital market. And they have invested huge money. If you see the mutual fund AUM, it has grown to almost 47 lakh crore rupees. So where this money will go? It has to go to the capital market. So no longer we are totally dependent on FII funding, but we have the funds from the retail investors. We have the AUM under the mutual fund, which keeps on balancing. And therefore, you have seen that there has not been much pressure on the banks to fund the businesses, but a lot of businesses have approached to the capital market to raise funds, and huge funds have been raised. So overall, capital market has done very well, and because of the liquidity, it keeps on going up. So that's the one reason as far as I am concerned. Now, let me tell you, there has been a talk on employment and all those things. Yes, the data shows that the employment has been problem. But, we forgot a fact that during the COVID era, the rural sector has done very well. It has almost contributed 3.7%. And a lot of people who have migrated from the urban sector to the rural sector has taken care by the rural growth. So I think somehow the balancing rural sector has balanced the downfall of the economy. But of course, as everybody has said, that unemployment is a challenge. And it is quite obvious, if we are seeing the black swan effect and 2 years we have seen strict lockdowns and mini lockdowns, it is bound to happen. And once everything opens, then we will see the growth in the economy, and the employment will also improve.
You brought in the rural area. Thanks for that. And that is when I will go and give the mic to Professor Mahendra Dev. Professor Dev, did rural India do that well over the last 2 years? And what are the fault lines there? There is so much to talk about in agriculture, but but I'm saving that for the next few questions. Right now, I'm just asking you this: that how did rural India do during the COVID period?
I mean, it's true that the agriculture growth has done well in the last 3 years. In fact, last 2 years, 3.6% and 3.9% growth rates. But the problem is there are few problems I will list. One is the the agriculture rural incomes and wages are lower in spite of agriculture growth. Because this year, particularly, the terms of trade have gone against agriculture. What the farmers pay for farm inputs and non-agriculture consumer goods, they have to pay much higher, including health, than what they get incomes. And the recent survey of the NSS also showed that from cultivation they get rupees 127 per day. The farmer gets, average farmer. Small and marginal farmers get much lower. And so there is demand problem in the for example, FMCG sector also facing demand problem, the two-wheelers and all. So rural areas, in spite of agriculture growth, value-added growth, high, the rural non-farm, because rural non-farm includes 51% of the MSMEs in the country or in the rural sector. They also face problems. And even farmers are getting more income from wages and non-agriculture income. So that way, there is a rural stress in the economy. So that has to be addressed with much more initiative from the government than given in the budget.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Amar Patnaik. You called this a missed opportunity. What were those areas that you were looking for where the government, in your opinion, should have been stressing?
Number one, I would think, is health infrastructure. Now, look at the budget. Madam Finance Minister starts with the health sector, and in fact, congratulates or let's say, in very glowing terms about the health infrastructure, health workers and health doctors. But till now, it's not just a kind of happening of the current year or the pandemic period. Our health infrastructure, when I say health infrastructure, not just the physical infrastructure at the primary health care centers, at the sub-primary health care centers, but even the resources in terms of healthcare workers. It's really fortunate that we didn't see the kind of wave and hospitalization in Omicron. But imagine a situation had Omicron taken a shape where it may not have been fatal, but hospitalization would have been more, then we didn't have the health, and particularly given the fact that the contamination rate was high, then we wouldn't have had even healthcare workers to look after the patients. So I thought this was a great opportunity. That's why I said it's a missed opportunity. Great opportunity to revamp completely our rural health infrastructure, both in terms of access and also in terms of building medical colleges in every district, having the healthcare workers, trying to get the tertiary healthcare. We have the private sector in tertiary healthcare, but we could have, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences is now developing what are called as satellite centers in tier 2 cities. We could have given a kind of enable the private sector hospitals, the big ones, to even explore that and go probably incentivize them in such a way that they could actually invest in the primary sector. The government's own effort would have probably, as Madam has said, it will crowd in private investment in other areas. But I would have thought that it would happen in health. So this is one missed opportunity. The second important thing is, you see, agriculture, health, education, anything you take, this is in the state list. So the idea is to probably strengthen the states. At the time, even during the pandemic, the policy, the announcements, the SOPs used to come from the center, but these states were actually implementing it. Having been there in Orissa, I've seen it. If we managed it well, We managed it by community participation, using our women SHG groups. So this is the field reality in which the health sector delivers. The out-of-pocket expenses continue to be very high. And that's in rural India even higher compared to the urban side. So I think this is one area which, one is health. The other one is the federal equity. I call it as federal equity.
Yeah.
Look, cess and surcharge. The government continues. Now it has reached 17.15 or 17.25% of the total income. Now, and it was 3,74,000 crores last year. Now this year it is 4.34. This is not shareable with the states. So the states are getting squeezed, whereas they have to actually deliver these services and health and education, all that matters to people, all that we can bring in inclusiveness. And since one of the key points, 7 key deliverables was inclusive development, I thought these would get covered. And this has not happened. As far as agriculture is concerned, I agree with the fact that the growth rate in agriculture has increased. But look at the income of the farmers, because that's also contributing to the demand. So rural demand hasn't picked up really. The farmers' income, the MSP, today I raised it in the parliament, that currently, if you do not take the opportunity cost of that land which the farmers are using into the calculation of the MSP and do it as A2 plus FL, that is family labor, a time will come when people, as it is already happening, they find that it is better to spend time or look for work under NREGS, where probably the payments are more, than to do agriculture and wait for one full season. So the farmers' income is not growing at all, and the input costs have gone up, despite all the subsidies that the state governments are giving. So these are the two important aspects where I thought there were missed opportunities. One was health. One is establishing a more robust federal equity by distributing, sharing a portion of the cess and surcharge, or leaving it to the states to generate some kind of an income. The the third one is the, I was very surprised actually, that is about the privatization receipts, disinvestment receipts. Now, disinvestment receipts are in the RE itself is down by about 1 lakh crore. And in the BE, this year, current year, it is at the even less than the RE level. I really do not understand how last year it was pegged at 1.75 lakh crore then. In what kind of calculation had gone into it? So if the government has no intention to generate those resources, I'm not coming to tax GDP ratio also, which is again lower than last year. So I think these are the things which the government could have done and spent on the social sector, which in every out of the 21 departments, 21 sectors I have a list. Out of 21, in 8 sectors as a percentage of GDP, the sectoral allocations have come down. In 5, it has remained at the same level. In another 6, it is marginal to the extent of 0.11%, 0.01. So nothing has happened in the social sector. So how are we calling that this is our key deliverable, which is inclusive development? It is just a lot of lip service and not really doing this. So all this will have impact on getting that rural demand, which is not happening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Patnaik, for bringing in a number of issues and saying and telling us so clearly about each of them. And a few of those issues, or in fact, all of them, are what Yamini has been working on and talking about for some time. Yamini, Dr. Patnaik was kind of addressing you. He said, where was the accountability in that 1.7 lakh crore disinvestment? And who's going to answer us for that? And why is
Dr.
it?
Amir, just a small,
sure.
supplement. The actual collection, the RE talks about 78,000 crores. The actual collection is actually 12,000 crores. I asked the secretary.
That's right.
12,000.
That's right.
So they're expecting the LIC to give the balance to, it may not even reach that level. So I don't know how this 1.75 lakh crore was reached.
Absolutely.
Number 2,
I was looking at
Professor Kapoor talked about the unemployment situation. It is even more serious because the labor force participation has itself come down from 46 to about 42%.
Yeah.
On top of that, unemployment. So these are serious concerns, serious fault lines.
Thank you so much. So, but the question that I want to ask you about, Yamini, is that given these points that Dr. Patnaik made so forcefully, where we have these number of sectors where the money has come down, there are these sectors where it has virtually remained unchanged. So where has the money gone? I mean, that's one question that people ask, and especially, and this is a specific question to you, what do you make of this drastic cut in the MG Narega? Given what Dr. Radhika Kapoor has said, given what Professor Mahendra Dev has said, and what Dr. Patnaik is saying, were you expecting this reduction in outlays to Manrega?
Thanks, Samir. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to listen to what everyone has been saying. And I think so many critical points have been made, which in more ways than one, I think, highlight the trade-offs that the finance minister confronted as she was thinking through how to balance the budget. And I think there are, in some senses, three things that were probably on her mind. On the one hand, there is the immediate challenge that the government has been grappling with over these last 2 years of the pandemic, which is the provision of basic relief and the bare minimum that needs to be done to ensure that at least we are starving away deep hunger and starvation. So if you look at the budget from expenditure as a percentage of GDP from 2020-21 onwards, you'll see that in the year 2021, expenditure had reached about 17.78% of GDP. Last year, and the bulk of the money that was spent actually was not so much on health. In fact, it was largely the elevated Narega costs, the public distribution system, and even if you take away what was brought in terms of the FCI arrears back into the budget, the expenditure was still considerable on these two key things. And there was a brief period in time where some Jan Dhan Yojana money was upfronted, PM Kisan money was upfronted, etc. So there was some amount of expansion, no doubt. And last year, like in the years preceding, two complexities also were confronting the finance minister in terms of how the fiscal math has been projected. And the complexity is that for some time now, our projections of revenue receipts and our expectations of monetization through disinvestment have always been higher than what was actually achieved. And that was in more ways than one contributing to the fiscal deficit targets not being met and all the off-budget activity that was going on. And, last year was the 1 year where, in fact, you would expect to see a significant drop in revenue receipts. We did to a degree, although the real hole was poked by disinvestment. Yet for the current FY, when we budgeted last year, we still pinned our hopes on disinvestment, as was said before, 175,000 crores. And a lot of and last year too, the challenge of managing immediate relief. Already in February of 2021, the finance minister was confronting the question mark of how do you move towards growth and sustainable GDP, sustainable economic recovery. Already last year, we were beginning to see signs of K-shaped inequality in response, whatever alphabet you want to take. I don't want to get into quibbles around alphabets, but the fundamental point, which all the data have pointed to, and I think we all, at least on this panel, fundamentally seem to agree with, that to a degree, the recovery has been strong in the formal economy, and the real hit has happened in the informal economy, and incomes at the bottom of the pyramid has been most significantly affected. And even as the rural economy, and more specifically agriculture, saw continuous growth, the move of labor back into agriculture has essentially meant that a substantive part of the informal economy is now effectively functioning on subsistence economy. We were already dealing with this odd reverse reversal of structural transformation, it has now got completely exacerbated. I think at that point, though, the decision was, let's piggyback and bet on that formal sector recovery and let's move forward in the direction of growth. And I think part of the expectation was, although as you saw last year too, there were cuts in revenue expenditure, specifically in the budget of last year, and we saw the same infamous Narega cut. Health expenditure didn't move very far. Education expenditure didn't move very far. The PDS was expected to cut down to a degree. And the demonetization was going to lead to a little bit more, sorry, not demonetization, disinvestment was going to lead to a little bit more resources, which potentially could have covered the excess capex, which is the bet that the government has taken from last year onwards. This year, it's got exaggerated. But I think that 2 years into the pandemic, when you know continuously, and that's what I mean by the trade-off. So the question is, I don't quibble. It's a different argument about whether or not capex is going to give you jobs and growth, or capex of the big ticket infrastructure type of capex that they are planning to do, highways, roads, ports. Some might be necessary. A lot of it is mechanized. Is this going to give you jobs? There is this move towards giving some capex to states, which has an interesting federal dimension, and I hope we can talk about it later. But the question I think that was confronted was, are we out of the relief story? And are we ready to look forward or not? And I think continuously, we have taken the bet that we are out of the relief story. And honest to God, we are not. You don't need to look very far. Just look at elevated Narega numbers. Now, with Narega, the argument that has consistently been presented, and it's not an argument that is new to this year or the last, it's an argument that has been flowing through since 2012 when Narega budget started getting cut relative to demand, is that this is a demand-driven scheme. Therefore, whenever you see elevated demand, the government of India will provide and reimburse states. Now, anyone that has followed public finance management systems in the government, and anyone that has looked at Narega, you don't even have to look at implementation, just go to the website. You will see two things very clearly. Whenever there is low budgetary allocation, two critical things happen. Number one, you see delayed wages, which is why Narega has been carrying forward a wage liability consistently now for almost a decade. And related to that, therefore, you see significant delays in wage payments. So that 15-day guarantee that is embedded in the law is irrelevant. Secondly, state governments are smart enough to know that this is going to happen. So they automatically do a lot of demand rationing. How do they do it? They do not open work sites. So end of story. That is why today you still have 77 lakh households as of the 1st of February that had demanded work and not actually received work. And that is only the demand that is being captured in our MISs. It's likely that demand is even more, and we don't know where that's going. So what sense does it make to say, I will give you more if you need, when even today you don't have enough to spend at 98,000 crores for this F1? And I just find the argument that Narega is demand driven when in actual fact it is not. We've never paid out that employment guarantee if work is not provided in 15 days for the most part. So I find that argument is a cop out. The reality is you should be budgeting sensibly, recognizing where you are. A second point I want to quickly make is that if you look at what's happened with basic public services, and we don't talk about this very much, through multiple lockdowns, we have closed our education services, we have closed nutrition services, we have closed even health activity beyond what was provided for COVID. And if you look at release and expenditure numbers, scheme by scheme by scheme, you will find, and it was perhaps right for the government to do this, especially in the early years of early months of the start of the financial year, both for the previous financial year and this one, when we saw lockdowns and serious COVID surges, to essentially say, hold on to releases for these critical schemes for the first 2 quarters of the financial year. So this year, Samagra Shiksha, flagship Government of India program for education, 38% funds have been released in the latest data. In December, it was showing at 26%. Jal Jeevan Mission, the flagship, besides expenditure showing in UP, only 26% funds was released. National Health Mission, last year, expenditure was down to 65%. For non-COVID related health activities. ICDS Poshan Abhiyan, there's a Poshan Abhiyan, I think it's called, I forget the name of the exact scheme. Again, releases have been really low. So we have stalled basic public services, which are also a necessary part of what will kickstart growth, build demand, contribute into all the capex that you want to do. And now that we are close to 2 years into the pandemic and slowly learning to live with it, finally today schools have opened in Delhi. on the 14th of February. After 2 years, my child who's been running around here because he has no school to go to will be out in school and not troubling me. All of this means that we are kicking back basic services. So government expenditure is going to be high. Take education. Yeah. You've seen a massive movement from private sector back into government enrollments. ASAR survey is showing that. Schools, I mean, those even basic things like painting the walls of those schools is going to cost us money, but we haven't actually added that much into the Samagra Shiksha budget. Just as one example, while state budgets are strapped, I completely agree with Dr. Patnaik. This issue of cesses combined with the fact, and as a consequence, state share as a percentage of gross tax revenue has stayed static at about 29%, and you're not releasing centrally sponsored schemes, which funds for, which means that essentially, and states rely on them for a lot of this. So essentially, state budgets too are extremely constrained. All of this is creating a context where, for this year, again, the question that I would have asked and try to answer as if I were to think of it from a policy making point of view, do I take the pedal of relief? Is a time right? Or do I do more relief? Because I'm contracting expenditure. Expenditure as a percentage of GDP has gone from 17.78% in 2021 to 16 point something percent in 2022, and it's projected to be down to 15.4% in 2023. At a time where actually my net tax revenue collection is 1% of GDP higher than I had anticipated, despite failing on disinvestment. So there was a little bit of fiscal space. Fiscal deficit is down from 9.2 to 6.9 for this year, to drop further to 6.4. We are prioritizing fiscal consolidation to a degree. Was this the right time? I don't know. There are, of course, other concerns, but we can't afford to take a pedal off these basic elements of relief. If you're contracting expenditure, you have the choice between CapEx and RevEx. I think for this year too, I would have probably prioritized RevEx and found other ways of perhaps through maintenance and providing more to states, doing a different kind of CapEx for this year.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Patnaik. Yes, please.
Yeah, about relief that she talked about. You see, it's actually the detail lies. The devil lies in the detail, as they say. If you look at the food subsidy, it has come about 90,000 crores this year. Of course, the finance minister, I've said it in the parliament, that she did the best thing that is possible in terms of accountability and transparency by getting it off the budget, below the budget line, into the budget last year. But it has come down by 90,000 crores. Now, this relief, which has been given by way of Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana or in the states from the State Food Security Act, it's actually a sunk cost. Because the food has already been purchased or has been procured by giving the MSP rates. And it is supposed to have been getting stored in the godowns and instead of warehouses. Instead of that, is now being distributed to the people. Despite doing this, your food subsidy is down by 90,000 crores this year, which basically means this is not a stress on this year's budget. Then the second point here is the fact that when it comes to in this the entire budget, people say it is damn good to be actually spending money on government-led investment, infrastructure investment, and that will spur growth, pump prime the economy, do everything. But if you look at the last year's 2.91% of GDP in current year, and if you take the states things, it's about 4 some odd. But if you look at the last year's capital formation, last year in 2021-22, the capital formation was 1.70% of GDP. So not all the capital investment that was projected got invested in creation of infrastructure. If you, I'm waiting for the demands which actually at sea. I think a lot of it actually went into, which is also considered, is classified as capital investment into stocks and into giving, government securities and lots of these areas, because this is what they do. But the capital formation, gross capital formation, is only 1.70% of the GDP. If we exclude repayment of past loans is also included there. So what happens to bet on these capital investment, and which has grown now 35% this year, including the 1 lakh crore, but given to the states is linked to conditionalities, which I think again is unfair. It is trampling on the government's every state's rights. They decide what is important. What is important in Orissa is not probably important in Gujarat or in Kerala. But they have done that. So that's a separate issue. But if you look at capital investment creating jobs, there are two issues over here. First is the lag. If you look at the statistics, which is available in the Niti Aayog, in fact, I had written an article on this, that India's record of completion of projects on time so as to get an ROI which would attract private investment because of this government-led infrastructure investment is not going to happen, is not happening. There is the cost of capital is turning out to be much more because of the delays and because of the leakages and because of various supply side problems, and therefore the private investment is not picking up in this country. It has not happened last year. It is not going to happen this year. What is happening, however, is that only a handful of people, of course, are investing in the capital investment, which is not generating adequate jobs as is expected to generate. And therefore, the jobless growth that has happened in this country for years. It's not just last year, not just this year. I'm just saying last so many years. The idea is how to get this private investment into the economy. And I think that's something in the finance committee. I keep saying this to all bankers, that India's problem is that the cost of capital is still very high. The cost of transaction is very high. The cost of intermediation is very high. If you're talking about digital revolution, then decrease the spread. It is still possible.
Amit, can I
Thank
make
you.
a comment?
Thank you. Of course. Yeah.
Just to put this discussion context, our the finance ministry team led by the finance minister have taken a what I would call a very hardline Keynesian position, that you just focus on investment and focus on growth, and everything else, whether it's employment, etc., will go that way. Completely, ignoring the distributional equity aspects, which and now, from what Yamini said, if she was the finance minister, she would have gone the other way, and in fact sustained the revenue expenditure. Especially, everything has been cut. Food subsidy has been cut. Health expenditure has been cut. There's just 5,000 crores for vaccines. All the main items, social expenditure overall has been cut. It is incredible. Manrega has been cut, rural development, which is mainly, the spending on Manrega. All those have been actually cut. Now, if I were to take the Yamini kind of thing, I would spend mainly on that and not increase the, the allocation on capital expenditure. But in fact, they could have also thought of a less extreme, a more middle path. Because if you look at how much the capital expenditure has gone up, the budget mentions that it's gone up from 6 trillion last year to 7.5 trillion this year, which is a 25% increase. Actually, the increase is much more, because that 6 trillion includes the subventions that were made to cover the liabilities of Air India before Air India.
Yes.
Now, if you make the correction for that, you have actually gone from something like 5.5 trillion to 7.5 trillion. So that's a 2 trillion increase on a 5.5 trillion base, and that's like a 33% increase in capital investment. You could have done the increase in capital investment. It's necessary for medium term to restore growth and so on. But you could have done it. Could have increased it by 15%. You could have increased by 20% instead of 33%, and still maintained all the the sort of anti-distress expenditure that we did in the last 2 years, instead of behaving as if the pandemic and all the stress caused by that is over. So really, I think a much more middle path would have been better. But I don't want to knock the role being given to public investment, because of course there are lags and so on. Dr. Patnaik was referring to this. But overall, we do know that in the Indian context, public investment is the driver, which does drive in crowd in private investment after a lag, after 2-3 year lag. So I think public investment is important, but it need not go on this bang solution that raise it by 33% and cut down revenue expenditure on all these services. But have taken a middle path.
Can I come in?
Wonderful. Yes, yes.
Can I say
I was about. Okay. Shall I go first to Radhika?
Okay, I just wanted to follow up on what Professor Mandal said. Actually, I'm not even sure if it's Keynesian really, because if you look at expenditure, the total expenditure, which has increased from 37.7 lakh crores to 39.4 lakh crores, amounts to less than 5% increase in nominal terms. And when you ask for inflation, in real terms, it's not increased. So it's only one component of the expenditure, which is of the expenditure, which is capital expenditure, that has increased at the expense of revenue expenditure. So I'm not even sure if we can call it Keynesian in that sense. But in terms of taking a bet on what strategy, I think, yes, I mean, to reinforce what Professor Mandal said, I mean, we basically put all our eggs in one basket. That CapEx is going to stimulate demand, CapEx is going to increase employment, and eventually this CapEx is going to crowd in private investment. But whether that is going to, I mean, of course, some people have pointed out that the increase is actually not even 2 lakh crores, it's actually less than that. And this is simply an accounting exercise. But even if it's less, I mean, my concern is not whether it's a little less than 2 lakh crores or not, but the fact that whether this 2 lakh crores is in fact going to fructify and create the employment that we need immediately. Because as a medium-term growth strategy, this sounds macroeconomically perfectly sound to me, given that we've been slowing down even before the pandemic. In 2019-20, our growth had collapsed 3.7%. This was because of a private investment slowdown. So macroeconomically, the strategy of pushing public investment to eventually crowd in private investment makes sense. My worry is this doesn't solve the jobs crisis that we are facing in the immediate term, and which is only aggravating. Because like everybody on this panel has pointed out, if you look at the nature of investment that is undertaken by the central government, typically, these are very large projects. They have long gestation periods. You have to plan them, you have to implement them. And more importantly, these are very capital intensive in nature and highly mechanized. So the belief that a big push to investment will create a lot of jobs is a little bit misplaced. And you need to look no further than India's experience between 2000 and 2011-12. Now, that was a period when the share of construction in total employment in India doubled. And this was also a period when we saw a sharp rise in investment of 10 percentage points. And prima facie, that's taken to believe that it was the investment boom which drove construction employment. But subsequent research has shown that actually that huge increase in construction employment was in fact driven by rural construction employment, which grew at 2.5 times the growth in urban construction employment. So it was the construction works which were being taken place in rural areas, which were far more labor intensive in nature and had strong backward linkages with other industries that actually gave an impetus to construction employment. So I think for this, for the central government to be able to spend this kind of money, and especially, given the past record, we know from, the CAG data that as of November 2021, even the 5.45 lakh crores of last year, only 50% of that had been spent. I think it's rather unreasonable to assume that this expenditure will have the desired effect in terms of job creation. I know Yami said some very interesting things about the allocation which has been made to the states, the 1 lakh crore interest-free loans for capital expenditure. But I'm a little optimistic in the sense that hopefully, I don't know what the conditionalities of these loans will be, how they are going to be distributed. But to the extent that state governments are perhaps better placed to choose projects in local communities, which are more labor intensive in nature and can generate a multiplier effect in the local economy faster, might be a better thing. And again, so one part of this macroeconomic strategy is whether we're going to be able to implement it effectively or not. The second is that by putting all our eggs in this capex-led growth basket, we've completely ignored the consumption, the demand side. Now, here too, we are assuming that when this capex-led growth happens, it creates employment, this will generate incomes, and this will drive consumption. But the trouble is that, again, if this does not happen quickly enough, there is a serious risk of exacerbating the K-shaped recovery. There is a serious risk of further pulling down average consumption expenditure, which we already know that in 2021-22 is 5% lower than what it was in 2019-20. And that decline in consumption is only going to disincentivize private investment. So I think that this is a very, very high risk strategy, be it in terms of growth or be it in terms of giving an impetus to job creation, because it can't possibly generate the kind of benefits that we need in the immediate term. The other strategy which the government seems to be banking on excessively is the production-linked incentive scheme, where we are giving away almost 2 lakh crore over the next 5 years to 14 industries, subsidies for increasing production. Now, of course, this is something which is hotly debated. Industrial policy is a subject which is hotly debated across the world, not just in India. And the production-linked incentive scheme marks the return of industrial policy in India. And I don't quibble with that, because I think given that we've traditionally not done well in manufacturing, our share of manufacturing in GDP has remained sluggish at 18%, even post-91, we do need a strategic vision of industrialization. But at this point, given that we're giving away subsidies worth 2 lakh crores, I think it's worth rethinking how we can possibly reorient the PLI scheme, at least in certain sectors, to link it to employment creation and not just to production. It may be in terms of the mobile phone industry, but there are huge SOPs being given. Can we not link that to employment creation? But again, PLI will have its limits, be it in terms of investment or growth or employment creation, because again, this is very capital intensive in nature, and these are very, very large units. The elephant in the room is the MSMEs, which are more labor intensive in nature and where the government has done very little, barring the emergency credit line guarantee scheme. And here too, the units which have availed of this emergency credit line scheme have basically been larger units, because when the government announced this program, the CLGS program, it concomitantly changed the definition of what MSMEs are in India, actually increased the investment limit upwards. Result of it, larger units came into the ambit of MSMEs, and it is these larger units which have used bulk of the guarantees. So the small guys, the micro guys, the ones who are in the informal sector have not been able to avail of this. And that's really where the distress lies. And that's what needs to be tackled through some kind of support, possibly, job preservation scheme, wage support, so that actually that can put some income in the hands of people.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Yeah, not just for speaking on the MSME issue, but also on clarifying the issue with the PLIs. That indeed was something we all need to understand. I'll just go to Professor Mahendradev, whatever you are wanting to say, but I would like to add that I'm also curious to hear from you what you think of this, of the MSP allocation. That there's been headlines on how that has gone up significantly. So please, Professor Mahendradev.
The same thing what others have been talking about, these inequalities, whether Vivek Debra agrees or not, the K-shaped, it is a real thing. And inequalities have been rising, but the pandemic has increased further, widened the inequalities further last 2 years. You can see the corporate sector has done well, stock market has done well, but informal sector, MSMEs and all, lots of loss of jobs, incomes. So it will take 1 or 2 years more to recover all the losses, these things. So there is a need for a growth model, which is different from what is given in the budget. I am for investment in public in infrastructure and all, but there is a need to have social infrastructure is also needed. It's not just physical infrastructure, but like Dr. Patnaik mentioned, health education. Because any country you see, the human capital is the most important thing, which has East Asia and other countries shown. So, and in the rural areas and also urban poor, there is the divide in health and education. You can see the digital divide, education in which the rural people could not get. And also the social protection programs are equally important, whether you call it food subsidy or the Narega, which Dr. Amini said correctly. I mean, everybody talks, many economists talk, it's a demand driven. Why do you worry about allocations in MG Narega? I think, I was talking to some activists. They said, unless you allocate the problems mentioned by Dr. Amini, the wage delays and other things will happen. So there is a need for allocation in these MG Narega. And also another problem is malnutrition. Malnutrition is quite high in spite of some achievements in NFHS data, particularly Eastern India, other, very high, 40-50% also. So there you need, they mentioned the Saksham, Anganwadis and all, but there is no increase in allocations. So I think there is a need for a slightly different growth model. I agree with the infrastructure push and all, but I think we have to allocate for social infrastructure like health, education, and social protection programs. Coming to MSP, what Dr. Patnaik mentioned is correct, that also, because when I was chairman of CSCP, we were doing the C2 plus kind of, cost per thing, but later the government said A2 plus FL kind of thing. So we were fixing based on the C2 plus FL cost. And, but there is a need for, diversification, which including Punjab,
yes.
Because
Yes.
this water, 3 crops consume. The rice, wheat, sugarcane consume 80% of the water. It is not sustainable. So there is a need for diversification to, horticulture and the oil seeds and pulses, and to livestock and fisheries. Because but the problem is that you can't ask Punjab farmers to shift immediately. There is a need to give them a plan and money, how to diversify the crops from rice to other crops, for example, maize or other crops, because unless they get incomes, which is risk-free kind of thing, fruits and vegetables, they say, the value, the perishable commodities, whereas we have Amul model where, milk is doing well. So that kind of models with value chains and all you need. So agriculture, there is a need for diversification, but on the other hand, MSP, you can't remove immediately. It needs, once the farmers are given a roadmap and others one, and also it cannot be a central government dictated, kind of farm laws. Because state governments, in fact, most of the things, whether it is health, education, or even infrastructure, all the expenditure itself is more 60% or more the state government spend. So their role, I think the so-called cooperative federalism is very important. I think we have to go together. In the case of agriculture reforms, we should leave it to states and whatever they want, because one central government law cannot fit in all the diversified states. So they should have their own reforms suitable to their socio-economic conditions and local conditions of cropping patterns, because cropping patterns differ thing. So MSP, it is needed, and you can't remove immediately.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dev. I will come to Mr. Ajay Thakur. Ajay,
can I just quickly, I wanted to just add two
things. Sure.
And we move on to a different point.
Sure, Yamin. Sure.
But so just to very quickly, I think, so I'm all for more public investment, I think that what worries me is that in this moment in time, to completely ignore the distributional consequences of the nature of investments you're making, given the scars, particularly to the informal sector, is both going to be a long-term drag on growth, which is really what everybody certainly in the finance ministry wants to focus on, and also going to have long-term other kinds of consequences. And therefore, the question that I would ask is public investment where? So I agree with Radhika that I think that the the capex push towards states is a really good starting point. But the capex push towards states is not backed up with planning capacity at the states. And Professor Mandal has pointed this out first and made me think about this long and hard with the absence of the planning commission. What are we really doing to build planning capacity in states? And it varies. Bihar, UP are at a very different place to other states. But linked to that also, the kind of conditionalities that have been linked with this 1 lakh crores, even in the budget speech, it was going to be about PMGSY. Now, that both given our political economy is going to create disincentives for state governments because many of them are run by opposition political parties. But even if we were to get over that, the ability of states to determine what is the nature of labor intensive public investment they want to make at this moment in time, I think that those conditions simply do not exist, coupled with the limited devolution that is going to them. The third related issue that I think we do want to ask and think about is our emphasis on big ticket capex. Does it necessarily create conditions for the kind of crowding in of public investment that will make markets work for the poor? To my mind, the most fundamental lesson from the farm laws fracas is that actually we don't have a good enough understanding of what 2 decades of liberalization has done to shifting the dynamics of local markets. They are not the markets of the old, which perhaps the left are hoping for. They are also not the imagined markets as sophisticated as our capital markets are, that those who are pushing for complete market reforms are. There's something in between. We need to understand that. Imagine if we said, all right, let's try and push towards just building basic physical markets, hearts. In lots of parts of India, you would create immediate employment, and you may actually create conditions for better APMC reforms and actually hopefully for more free market exchange at the local level. So I think if we were to invest in local rails to get you from Purnia to Katihar or from Patna to Purnia faster, we may actually get more bang for buck than in that bullet train that is still not running between Ahmedabad and Bombay. Now, this is a whole other challenge for India, which is that we have, after the immediate gains of 1991, which took us through till the middle of the 2000s, we have not been able to think through what the next architecture of our growth model should be. There were many things that we haven't done that we need to do on the reform trajectory, but things changed a lot in our social and economic lives, and we need to reimagine what that growth imagination is. I don't know that any of us have, we keep talking, even in this room, we're all talking about jobs, but I don't know that I have a good enough answer for a long-term story for good, high-quality jobs for India in the next 20 years. So we need to think differently. We need a very different set of tools. And that's the role that perhaps all of us through forums like this should play.
Wonderful.
Just follow up to what Yamini said.
Just...
Okay.
Can I get back to both of you, Dr. Patnaik and Dr. Kapoor? I will just get in Ajay Thakur. Ajay, apart from what you wanted to say, I also want you to comment a little bit on the MSME issue. What do you think? Beyond the budget, what is it that of course you should talk about what the budget says, but beyond that also, what is it that you would want to see for the MSMEs? But please, Ajay Thakur.
In last 25 years or 30 years, I have, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah. In last 25 years, I have seen different, heard different school of thought. Some people saying that we should abandon subsidy. Some people keep on saying we should give the subsidy. Some people say subsidy put a pressure on the, revenue. And some people say that. So, all these things keep on arising, and we never come on to any solution. And then, suddenly we start talking about why should we reduce the subsidy. No, first of all, let us try to understand these 2 years. Policies can't be, you can't frame any policy which suit to these 2 years. These 2 years have been something which has been extraordinary across the world, whereby we have seen the increase in inflation, we have seen the job, reduction in the job, where we have seen, macro enterprises especially got shut down. Now, please try to understand how the macro, small and medium enterprises work. And first of all, let me, put this point that, micro, small enterprises, the definition has been changed, but it doesn't exclude anyone. For example, micro enterprises, it has been said that investment up to 1 crore comes, all the macro enterprises where the investment is up to 1 crore, they qualify as macro enterprises, and then rest on. Say, for example, medium term enterprises, they have said the investment up to 50 crore. So most of these enterprises have been taken care of. Now, please try to understand where we have got 6 months of strict lockdown, followed by 3-4 mini lockdown. How you can think of that, these macro enterprises can work and all those things. The second problem that we have faced is that most of the 94% of the MSMEs, 94% are macro enterprises. Now, these macro enterprises are so informal that, you can't make a formula to cater to their requirements. So it becomes very difficult. You have to go onto the ground, try to understand what are their problems. And many of the times, you may not even try to understand what their problems are and how to take care of that. Now, who can take care of that and in what way, I'm still trying to understand. But one solution I keep on giving to the policy maker, that let us incentivize these enterprises so that they can convert themselves into the formal sector, so that all the policies can take care of them. And that is the only way whereby we can do the well-being of macro enterprises so that they can create huge employment in the country. And there are only 2 sectors which can create employment. One is agriculture sector, and another is macro, small and medium enterprises. But some policy needs to be created where we should, shift these macro enterprises which are into informal sector and very much segregated to formal sector, and then I think things will improve. But one thing I have observed on the ground, that with the economy opening, all these enterprises slowly, getting into their business, and, things are settling down. And even now the government is not thinking of lockdown even after the Omicron, third wave of Omicron. So I think with the situation improving as the lockdown goes out, you will see, a lot of these enterprises again coming, and the employment start creating. But how to infuse the employment? I again think, as the private investment has not come, the government is under the obligation to increase the capex so that more and more jobs can be created, whether it's in infrastructure or housing, etc. For example, this 33% increase in the capex, then ECLGS scheme extension up to 2023, then 50,000 crore for hospitality sector and tourist sector. I think it will create a lot of employment, because you try to understand, hospitality sector create a huge employment. Now, in this lockdown period, the whole hospitality and the allied sectors were closed down, and therefore we have seen a lot of unemployment getting created. But with these incentives given to this tourism and hospitality sector, I think again you will see a lot of employment getting created. But I think at this juncture, capex, increase in the capex is very much required, and the government is on the right track.
You are muted.
Thank you so much, Ajay. Dr. Patnaik, you were coming in on some point.
So I'll just, in fact, I'll talk about the MSMEs, because I think, incidentally, for last 1 year, 1.5 years, in the Standing Committee on Finance, we are grappling with the issue of how to revitalize the MSMEs. We have had several discussions. Let me first give you a figure which will be the strictest possible figure. That is 77%, and this figure comes from the ministry, 77% of the registered MSMEs in India do not access formal finance. So your 94% of the people being in the formal sector, getting ECLGSs, the emergency credit guarantee line, all these things, is only catering to a very small number of people. And therefore, when we talk to the private sector as well. And the private sector banks assessment, the government banks, for example, they do not have a figure. I had written to the Prime Minister. There is no point talking about 10% increase over the last year in terms of allocation to MSMEs or loans to MSMEs or loans to agriculture sector. First, find out what is the credit gap, what is the credit requirement. And you'll be astonished that the private sector, SDFC Bank, ICICI Bank, and many other agencies, they have assessed that the MSME sector's credit gap currently is 25 lakh crore. It includes these people who are just not in the formal channel. So they have borrowed money at extremely exorbitant rates from friends, money lenders, relatives, and all these people. Now they have also created jobs. They have created demand. But we are just not accounting for them in this particular thing. This is the problem in implementation of the current budget, which is completely allocation driven. The second aspect, as Yamini ji said, is about the NREGS. Let me talk about Orissa. After the chief minister of the state wrote to the prime minister of the country, 794 lakh of back wages were released. Exactly what she was saying. And we have made, in the parliament, I made a demand day before yesterday saying that we are wanting 25 crore mandates, labor mandates, because the people who have come back from, let's say in Orissa's case, from Surat, from Bombay, from different places to their villages haven't returned. They're either looking for NREGS jobs or they are going to work they don't want to work as agricultural laborers. They want to work as NREGS jobs. Now, all these big ticket capital infra is good. In theory, it is very good. But if it is created in areas, because the conditionality says that it should be in alignment with the national master plan and the national asset monetization plan. That is not states, it will not solve the state's needs. Therefore, the jobs will never get created in the state in the areas they want. And therefore, the money which is the growth, I don't want to sound like a naysayer saying that it is going to only help a few handful of capitalists or something. But just I'm trying to say that it is actually exacerbating the inequity in the system, and that has been proven by the facts that has emerged through various reports in the last 2 years. So
thank you so much.
The macro picture is good, but the micro problem is these kind of things.
Wonderful, Dr. Patnaik. As we are nearing the end of the time that we have, there are a few questions that have come up from the audience, and these questions are, some of them are very critical, very important questions. I'm just reading out to you some of those that we must tackle. The big question that everybody asked the next day, that is, what about income tax rates? Why the income tax rates? Why weren't those changed? That's the standard thing that one is looking for. Inflation has gone up and therefore it will impact consumption. Why wasn't anything done about that? Anil Bharadwaj asks what is this push about capital expenditure of 7 lakh crore? Will it really impact private investment? In some sense, you have answered that question. But a very pointed question, or two very pointed questions on healthcare. One, the National Health Mission has got a nominal increase over last year, which means that non-COVID schemes will continue to be woefully short of funds. Why do you think this was the case even now? And the other is that the big question is that if we are trying to build a new India, and if in the backdrop of a new education policy, why is both the health and the education budget stuck at whatever level it was, or even come down further? So I'm just throwing these questions up. Anyone wants to answer this question, but specifically, Yamini, you've been asked to answer this question on the income tax slabs. Why do you think that wasn't changed? Because that would have helped spur some consumption. You can, of course, refuse to answer.
I don't know that I'm the best placed to answer that question. I think it does, though, bring up the larger question of our tax to GDP ratio. And in fact, so much of this, the trade-offs that government is making has a lot to do with that fundamental and foundational conundrum, and the fact that we have a regressive tax regime. But
only
only
1.5% pay taxes.
Yeah, I wouldn't have done tax cuts at this point, to be honest.
In any case, yeah. Dr. Mandal, why this? Why are we stuck with this meager allocation to health and education? Why do you think that wasn't increased?
Well, I think, I said this earlier, that we have, if I may use this term, a rather extremist, investment-led growth type of model.
Right.
I'm one of those who thinks that public investment is a very good thing, but it's so extreme that in the process, you've not only cut all the things that when they were saying the social protection schemes, food subsidies, Manrega and so on, but in real terms, you actually cut the expenditure on health if you adjust for inflation, and a very modest increase in education. Yamini may know better about where exactly the education allocation has gone, whether it's to
school education, no change in the percentage of GDP.
Much. Yeah. Now, the point is that, that to borrow that old 70-year-old term of the commanding heights, the real commanding heights of the economy are not, bullet train lines and all this kind of stuff. It is really education, because if you don't have a credibly educated population, you cannot skill them. We talk about skill mission, blah, 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 but how can you skill people who don't have the education requirement to absorb those skills? And this is a lesson from the East Asian model that we should learn. The Washington consensus hasn't worked anyways. The East Asian model has worked, and very clearly, human development is a key part of that. It's one of the leading things on which they base their thing, of course, combined with industrial policy and so on. That's another story. But I think it's just a mistake, because they, to think that these things don't matter, that you build roads, something you can physically see, and that's all. Road building is good, especially the Pradhan Mantri Gran Saroj Yojana is the best infrastructure project we've ever had in this country, started by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and I'm glad that they're putting more money into that. But you can't just ignore education, health. It becomes a very lopsided kind of developed growth model.
Thank you so much, Dr. Radhika Kapoor. The two sets of reform that we saw over the last couple of years, in the COVID period, some reform was pushed in, and a lot of people wondered whether it was the right time to do that. Even those who were convinced that the reform measures were right. The first, obviously, were the labor reforms. Was that they were pushed through, and over the next couple of years, we'll see them getting implemented. And Dr. Mahendra Dev, the farm laws that were brought in but had to be taken back. Now, how do you see the labor law working out, Dr. Kapoor?
On the labor law, it's got some pluses and some minuses, because there are 4 different codes, and each of them really needs to be, there are points pertaining to each of them. But what I want to say more broadly here is that, the whole narrative around the labor reform debate in India has been that our labor laws are too rigid, and they have actually disincentivized labor-intensive manufacturing in India. And that is why India has actually not been able to follow the East Asian model. But this fetish with simply hire and fire has really hurt both workers and industry, to my mind, because what's happened in this whole growth narrative, this is related to the discussion that Dr. Mandal was making and the points Yamini was making, is that in this whole growth framework, we simply think of physical infrastructure and we think of roads and ports. We don't think about investment in human capital. We treat the worker as a mere factor of production, and we think, how do we squeeze the wage bill so that we can enhance profitability and attract foreign investment and get people to set up factories here. But what we forget is that we have to enhance the competitiveness of our economy, which was actually an underlying theme of this 25-year vision of India at 100. That's not going to happen simply by building physical infrastructure. You have to invest in your labor force through education, through healthcare, and it's only then that worker productivity will enhance. So labor and the worker actually has to be put at the very heart of that growth model, and we have to recognize the importance of investment in human capital. And that's where, you can do all this industrial policy, but if you don't have a labor force with a basic level of industrial literacy, if I may call it that, none of this is going to fructify. We have traditionally had a comparative advantage in labor, but our inability to convert that comparative advantage into a competitive advantage and create the kind of industrial model that we see in East Asian countries is because we haven't invested enough in human capital. And that's why, it can't just be capex push. It has to be investment in human capital. And the labor regulatory regime needs to recognize this, that by having people on precarious contracts, by, reducing standards of conditions of work, making people work in difficult conditions, paying them very poorly, does very little to enhance that worker productivity. So to my mind, I think there's really a radical rethink of the labor regulatory regime, which is required to say, how do we enhance worker productivity, which works to the interest of both the worker and the firm, as opposed to just how do we make the contract more flexible so that workers can be hired and fired at the will of the company.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Kapoor, and thanks all of you. There are several issues, Sameer, that we could not talk about. The issue of corporate taxation, the question of whether we should have taxed the wealthy more because they have reaped most of the benefits of COVID. Should there have been a geographical focus? And on the other hand, do we see a final divorce between elections and budgets? For the first time, we saw that here was a budget on an election eve, and you did not have railway lines being given to Uttar Pradesh and Punjab. Do we finally see a stabilization in the tax regime where you do not have, little ups and downs and little nitbits here and there, except for the fact that I still wonder why squids should be cheaper in India this year than last year. If you saw the import tariff, they have gone down on squids. Squids and mussels are cheaper now. Umbrellas are more expensive. So some of that old regime still stays. I wonder why. But otherwise, you don't see too much of that tinkering. So I will end with, like I began, which is to again force you to give me one line on what you think should have been the one policy direction you would have liked to see in the budget. So just that one. Having said all this that you said, what was that one thing that you would have loved to see? So, Dr. Patnaik.
I think what we didn't talk about is the great action that has been taken on the climate action front, on the environment front.
Okay.
Just like the green bond, we should have had a health bond. People wouldn't have minded it, and we would have built up the health infrastructure.
Wonderful. Dr. Kapoor.
I would have said strike a balance between expenditure and capital expenditure instead of putting all our eggs in one basket.
Yeah, you said that very well. Dr. Mandal.
Well, I am exactly on the same page as Radhika on this. Investment trust is important, but not so extreme. And it could have been moderated with a much greater emphasis on human development, education, health, social sectors, and social protection, instead of just giving it up completely.
Super. Dr. Mahendra.
Yeah, I also have similar views. Basically, when I said that infrastructure push is good, but inclusive development, they could have done much better in terms of the social sector, social protection, agriculture, and rural development.
I'll go to Ajay Thakur with the hope that he's going to say something else. Dr. Ajay Thakur.
I think, MSME needs a more approach focus, where the data, etc., should be more, interpolated, whereby, a lot of focus should be there to bring the macro sector, especially, into the gambit of formal financing so that they can grow further and give a lot of employment to the country.
Wonderful, wonderful. Amini.
Well, it's all been said, so I'll add to what's said, all of which I already very much agree with. I think I would certainly have cut down a little bit of the cess and ensured that devolution to states at least came somewhat close to the expectations of the 15th Finance Commission, and rolled in that 1 lakh crore of capex into states and found other ways of better incentivizing states to do it. And just one last thing I'm going to sneak in here. We've talked a lot about expenditure allocations. Budget speeches are also political messages. I think that the political message was very much around a very matrix-like virtual digital 21st century future. And that's great if that can be achieved. But in that process, the finance minister also mentioned that given the learning losses of the last 2 years, we'll have more televised learning. Given the learning losses of the last 2 years, the message should have been, we must open schools now and make sure we invest in foundational learning, not make children sit in front of televisions and learn nothing.
Wonderful, wonderful. I mean, it's such a coincidence that we are all sitting in front of our laptops and doing this exercise, but can't help it. Thanks so much. The political message that one extreme political message that I must bring in here was that maybe it was because now we are so sanguine on this aspect that elections are not won with good economics, that it doesn't matter. So therefore, it's okay. We'll win the elections in any case. But it could only be possible with really bright and insightful minds like yours, that we could have covered so much in such little time. Thank you so much for helping us go through this slew of areas and cover just about everything that people are talking about, are curious about, and giving such straightforward, such clear and such simple logic to help us understand how to go forward. Thank you so much, all of you. Thanks, Samir, and thanks, Gurshad.
See, one more thing. I would like to give a lot of credit to the government, because one very good thing that they have done is, replacing the bank guarantee with surety bonds that they are talking about, because a lot of money under the bank guarantee got stuck in the working capital especially of a small and medium enterprise. So that's a very good move that the government has taken.
Yeah, thanks. We would have missed that. Thanks. So over to you, Gurshad. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Amir. It was such a wonderful discussion. Only thing I can tell you is, if you've been watching TV, then this is like, 1000x the quality discussion that there is. And it is possibly the only discussion where there is a consensus on, what we're trying to say. Let us focus. Yes. Let's bring back the inclusive growth on the table. It's a very, very important agenda. Let's not lose sight of that. And if I may, Amir, I hope you'll bring this all together in a very sharp, crisp article that we can capture. We'll also give the proceedings. And hopefully with the kind of people that are there on this panel, the government would listen. And the next year budget would be more inclusive than this year's budget. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.